you doing? Welcome back to the States.
How we doing, man?
Good.
Yeah, we tried to draft your ass last year. It's all worked out.
Yeah.
You remember that, right?
Yeah, that's what I was about to tell you.
Someday we'll get a chance to talk about that.
Yeah.
Nobody said anything was wrong, and that's exactly why this moment matters, because when an NFL organization believes in a quarterback, the signals are usually loud, they talk him up, they protect the narrative. They leave breadcrumbs on purpose, but with Shedeur Sanders, Cleveland hasn't done that. Not publicly, not consistently, and not in the ways teams usually do when they're confident. What's interesting is, nothing dramatic happened. No benching, no blow-up, no crisis to explain away, just a subtle shift in tone, fewer words, longer pauses, and decisions that feel carefully unfinished. And when you line those decisions up, not with headlines, but with how NFL teams actually behave, a different picture starts to form. Not about what Cleveland is saying, but about what they're intentionally avoiding. And once you notice that pattern, it's hard to unsee what it might mean for Shedeur going forward. So before we talk about talent or depth charts, we need to talk about the silence. What makes this situation easy to misunderstand is that nothing obvious has changed. There wasn't a press conference that shifted the tone. There wasn't a quote that forced clarification. There wasn't even a single decision you could circle and say, this is where it turned. And that's usually where people stop looking, because in the NFL, the most important moments rarely announce themselves. They show up in timing. In what doesn't get said? In how quickly or slowly an organization moves when it doesn't feel pressure to explain itself. Up until recently, the messaging around Shedeur Sanders followed a familiar rhythm. Not praise-heavy, not dismissive either. Just enough acknowledgement to keep the picture open-ended, which, in this league, is a very intentional place to keep a quarterback, but that rhythm has shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. You can see it in how conversations are being framed, where the emphasis lands and where it suddenly doesn't, in moments where clarity could be offered. But NFL teams are incredibly consistent in one area. They don't leave perception unmanaged by accident. If they believe the future is aligned, they guide the narrative. They soften uncertainty. They give media just enough material to stabilize expectations. When they don't do that, it's usually not because they're confused. It's because they're deciding how much certainty they're willing to show. And that distinction matters right now. Cleveland isn't correcting assumptions about Shedeur. They aren't amplifying them either. They're letting outside voices fill in the gaps. And that's rarely a passive choice, especially at quarterback, because this position doesn't live in a vacuum. It touches leadership hierarchy, locker room alignment, long-term leverage with the roster and the front office, which is why teams are usually careful about when they allow ambiguity to linger. What's different here is when this ambiguity appears, not after a loss, not after a public setback, but in a window where clarity would normally help everyone involved. That timing tells you this isn't about damage control. It's about option management. Teams create space when they're not ready to commit to a direction, even internally. They slow the conversation down. They reduce definitive language. They avoid statements that would box them in later. And when you see that pattern emerge without an obvious trigger, it usually means the evaluation has moved into a different phase, not louder, not urgent, just more cautious. Which raises the real question of this moment, not whether Cleveland believes in Shedeur, but what kind of belief they're still deciding on, because belief in the NFL isn't binary. It has layers, and the difference between them shapes everything that comes next. And to understand which layer this situation is drifting toward, you have to stop looking at Shedeur for a moment and start looking at how organizations behave when confidence turns conditional. NFL organizations don't just evaluate players. They manage belief internally and externally. That belief shows up in small, repeatable behaviors. Who speaks first? Who speaks carefully? And who suddenly doesn't speak at all. When leadership is aligned, messaging tightens. Not louder, tighter. You'll hear similar language from different people without coordination being obvious. You'll notice fewer qualifiers, less hedging, more comfort letting statements live on their own. When leadership isn't fully aligned, the opposite happens. Language softens. Specifics disappear. Statements feel technically correct, but strategically incomplete. That's not confusion. That's risk management. Front offices and coaching staffs are trained to protect flexibility, especially when the quarterback position is involved. Because once belief is expressed too clearly, it becomes binding, not just publicly, but internally. What's telling in Cleveland's case isn't disagreement on talent. It's restraint around commitment language. You don't hear absolutes. You don't hear timelines. You don't hear framing that narrows future options. That's a specific posture. It usually shows up when multiple outcomes are still being modeled behind the scenes. Not because anyone is panicking, but because no one wants to remove leverage too early. In these moments, organizations lean on process language. They emphasize evaluation windows. They reference competition. They stress patience, not urgency. Those words sound neutral. They buy time. They keep power centralized. And they prevent expectations from solidifying faster than internal consensus. This is especially common when leadership groups aren't disagreeing loudly, but aren't fully synchronized either, when the room isn't divided, but it isn't settled. In those rooms, silence becomes a tool. Not avoidance, not secrecy, a tool. It allows leaders to observe reactions, media narratives, locker room alignment, even how players respond to ambiguity. Quarterbacks feel this more than anyone, because their presence changes the emotional temperature of a building. Confidence radiates, so does hesitation, and when leadership is still calibrating how much confidence to project, they pull back. They let the environment speak for them. They watch what fills the gaps. That's where Cleveland is right now. Not making statements they'll have to defend later. Not correcting narratives that might resolve themselves. And not closing doors that could still be useful. This doesn't mean distrust. And it doesn't mean endorsement either. It means conditional belief. A state where leadership hasn't rejected a direct, but hasn't embraced it publicly enough to make it irreversible. And when you understand that state, you start to see why this moment feels distant. Why the tone has shifted without announcement. Why the organization seems comfortable letting uncertainty linger just a little longer than usual. Because the real work isn't happening in front of cameras. It's happening in rooms where alignment is still being tested. And that brings the focus back to the one variable that makes this balance so delicate. The mistake people often make at this stage is turning Shedeur Sanders into a conclusion. Either he's the answer or isn't. NFL teams rarely think way, especially not when the position carries this much leverage. Inside organizations, quarterbacks are treated less like destinations and more like variables. Pieces that change the math of everything on them. Timelines, contracts, authority structures. Even how patient the locker room is willing to be. From that perspective, what matters most isn't whether Shedeur has shown promise. It's how much certainty his presence forces the organization to reveal before it's ready, because once a quarterback becomes the guy publicly, the cost of reversing course multiplies. Draft capital gets framed. Coaching decisions get scrutinized differently. Short-term losses become harder to justify. That's why teams slow down when they sense moment approaching, even if the player hasn't done anything wrong. What's interesting with Shedeur is that his profile accelerates perception faster than performance alone really would. Not because of noise, but because of context. He carries visibility, expectation, and a narrative that doesn't need help spreading. That changes how organizations manage him. Instead of amplifying signals, dampen them. Instead of clarifying direction, they preserve ambiguity. Not to diminish the player, but to protect optionality, and optionality matters when the evaluation isn't finished, because risk at quarterback isn't just about on the field. It's about how safe hardens, how quickly flexibility disappears, and how much room leadership has to adjust without triggering backlash. Shedeur's presence compresses that timeline. If confidence grows too early, the organization loses the ability to move quietly later. If doubt appears too clearly, it shapes perception before internal decisions are final. So the safest posture is restraint. Let performance speak, but translate it yet. Let observers react, don't correct them. Let questions exist without rushing to resolve them, not indecision. That's control, and it creates a unique tension for the player involved, because for someone like Shedeur, silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels evaluative, weighted, like every rep exists inside a larger, unspoken calculation. That can cut two ways. It can press space for growth, or it can signal that belief hasn't crossed the threshold where protection kicks in, and which one it is doesn't reveal itself immediately. It shows up later, in how quickly opportunities expand, in how decisively choices get made, and in whether ambiguity eventually resolves or quietly becomes the answer. Right now, Shedeur isn't being elevated or dismissed. He's being held in place. And in the NFL, that's one of the most consequential positions to occupy. It can preserve space for growth, or it can signal that belief hasn't crossed the threshold where protection kicks in. Pause, and which one it is doesn't reveal itself immediately. It shows up later, in how quickly opportunities expand, in how decisively choices get made, and in whether ambiguity eventually resolves or quietly becomes the answer. Right now, Shedeur isn't being elevated or dismissed. He's being held in place. And in the NFL, that's one of the most consequential positions a quarterback can occupy, because it means the next shift won't be loud. It won't be announced. But when it happens, everything around him will suddenly feel much clearer. What makes moments like this difficult to read is that nothing forces clarity right away. There's no deadline attached to silence, no announcement that signals when ambiguity expires. Pause. Organizations can sit in this space longer than people expect, letting evaluations mature quietly, letting pressure come from the outside instead of creating it themselves. And for a while, that approach works, until it DOES in single quotes, because eventually, belief has to, either it consolidates or it disperses. Pause, and when that happens, the shift isn't subtle and it shows up in decisions that suddenly feel decisive, in language that becomes firmer without explanation, in opportunities that either or stop arriving all. Right now, Cleveland hasn't told anyone what it thinks about Shedeur. Not directly, but it has shown how carefully it's managing. Pause, and in this league, that kind of care usually means something is still beat. Not talent versus, but timing versus beat. Because the NFL doesn't rush certainty, it waits until it has to, and when it finally stops waiting, the answer tends to reveal itself all at once. But in what change?